Admiral Gillingham here, your Surgeon General. I think those who have joined us for prior Meet the Author sessions are aware that I'm an avid reader, that as I came on as a Surgeon General, I established the Surgeon General's reading list. Important to recognize that that's not homework. These are just a collection of books aligned across the 4 Ps, which is for the author's benefit, which is our strategic priorities of people, platforms, performance, and projection of medical power. But that I believe these are works that contribute to us achieving those strategic priorities. And I hope that folks will dip in. One way to stimulate that interest is to have these Meet the Author sessions so that you can understand the impetus for the books and the work and how we might profitably apply that in Navy medicine. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our authors today. We are privileged to have Dr. Brad Johnson, Professor of Psychology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the Naval Academy, and a faculty associate in the Graduate School of Education at Johns Hopkins. Also have his co-author, Dr. David Smith, Associate Professor of Sociology in the College of Leadership and Ethics at the Navy War College. They are authors of Athena Rising, holding it up here, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women, and their recently released book, Good Guys, How Men Can be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. And so we are thrilled that they're going to be available for the next hour to talk about primarily Athena Rising. They've agreed that they would give us a preview on Good Guys, and perhaps we'll have a session in the future where we can discuss that book. But in any event, Athena Rising is a guidebook about mentorship and the important roles that men need to play in eliminating the many barriers women face in securing meaningful mentorship. And so with that, I'd like to start our discussion with the first question. And gentlemen, thank you so much again for joining us. You're both former naval officers. Were there specific personal experiences in the Navy that motivated you to think about and research how men can be more inclusive leaders and better mentors and allies for women?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in, Dave, and you can hop right on as well. So yeah, I got my start as a Navy psychologist, and I ended up at the Naval Academy as a fairly junior professor. And one of the things that we got to do early in my tenure there was do a huge research study of actually retired Navy admirals who were still living. There was about 650 who responded. And we asked them about their experience with mentoring. And one of the really interesting things was almost all of them had a really salient early career mentor, and it meant a lot to them. Often these relationships continued until the mentor's death. They're often lifelong, really powerful mentorships. But we found that women are far less likely to have a mentor. And certainly when they have a mentor, they often don't get the same kind of very active sponsorship. And I think it was that big gender difference that I noticed early on in my research related to mentoring that really piqued some of my interest about the gender issue. And then the other thing for me, as we were just discussing, my amazing sister, Captain Shannon Johnson, who's the CEO at Bremerton Naval Hospital. Shannon also has been an active duty clinical psychologist, and I've had a front row seat to watching many of the gendered headwinds Shannon has encountered. I have to just say, nobody ever comes up to me and says I should smile more. And nobody ever tells me I shouldn't maybe run quite so fast on a PRT because the guys feel bad if I beat them. These are just a couple examples of the things that my sister encounters frequently, and she deals with that with tremendous grace. But it has stoked my interest in how men can show up and be more effective allies and collaborators with women.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Smith.
Yeah, it's a great question, Admiral. And I think that, in particular, like Brad, I think as a sociologist, I do my research all in the area of the intersection of gender, work, and family. So thinking about gendered perspectives of careers and work and how family intersects with that. And certainly some of the research I did as well that showed that, women, there were challenges there in particular around access to resources that made a difference in terms of progression in their careers, and certainly mentoring, the sponsoring or advocacy component of that, role modeling. Lots of these different aspects were not as available to women in the same way that they were for men. And I think, as Brad and I began to have these conversations around the overlap of our research, it was pretty obvious to us that in particular that that men were not engaging in doing this work in the same way that as they did for other men in particular. So, and didn't see, I think as we talk about like a women's mentoring program or sponsorship program, the minute gender or women was attached to it, guys would look at it and go, oh, that's not for me. That's not my issue. And so we often found that reframing these issues as leadership issues, right, that where men and women both have roles and responsibilities to do this work was really helpful in doing that. Like Brad, I have a personal connection to the work as well. I'm a Naval Academy graduate, as is my wife. And, my wife's a retired naval officer now also. And, I got to watch, like Brad, I had a front row seat to watching her career and the challenges that she faced that I never experienced. And it was just eye-opening. We would have these conversations, and then for me to go back into the workplace and to think about this for my female colleagues and how they were experiencing this in different ways and having these conversations. And so when Brad and I had the idea to sit down and do the research for Athena Rising, it was really important to me. And so we have a passion for this work.
Oh, that's great. No, the passion is evident in both of you. You write that many prospective mentors make assumptions when it comes to mentoring a woman. Could you outline for the audience some of those assumptions?
Yeah, there were still a lot of these out there, and they came up all the time that, that just because she's a woman, she must therefore, and we can fill in the blank, she must want or need something in particular. And often, because women are seen first and foremost as primary caregivers and nurturers in those roles, that therefore that must have primacy in terms of how they also approach their careers and their work. And just not the case, or that there's these suddenly, there's these dramatic differences between us as men and women that, the reality is that we have a lot of overlap in terms of our career aspirations and our goals and dreams out there. It was really interesting. I think one of the stories that Brad and I always love to share with audiences from one of our interviews that we did for Athena Rising, and that we had the chance to interview the administrator for NASA at the time, Robert Lightfoot, because one of his mentees was Janet Petra, who was a deputy director at the Kennedy Space Center. And, Robert told us that, he always liked to see himself as kind of this gender savvy guy, and he kind of got it and was really, not prone to making these assumptions. And he said that, one example was he was on a hiring committee once, and it was clear at the last few candidates that a woman was clearly the clear choice here. And before they made the offer for the job, he said, I want to just point out to everybody here that this job requires a lot of travel, and she just had a baby. I'm just not sure if this, is this the right job for her? And he said, fortunately for him, that there was this woman sitting across the table from him at the committee, and she just had these kind of flames coming out of her eyes. And she said, Robert, she's a smart woman. I'm pretty sure she knows that this job requires a lot of travel, and I'm really sure she knows she just had a baby. So if that's the case, why don't we just let her make that decision? And he said it was like, it was this aha moment, right? And here I was as a mentor and as an ally, thinking that I was really helping, right, by showing how thoughtful I was being, but in many ways I was still making assumptions, and it was helpful to have that kind of feedback from the female colleague on the committee.
Yeah, that was a memorable story from the book. Thank you. Dr. Johnson, anything to add?
Well, I would also just say, as men, I think we've got to be especially careful about the cloning thing. There's evidence that men in particular, women can do the same, but men especially like to clone their mentees in their own image, right? So I could easily make assumptions that she should do exactly what I've done in my career and not really take the time to discern what her career dream looks like. And I think a great mentor does that, right? And that requires the time, the generous listening, the really ferreting out what does your career dream looks like. If you could show up to work in a perfect world, 10 years from now, what would it look like for you? It's only when I really understand her dream that I can open the right doors and make sure that I'm, networking her the right way, giving her the right counsel. I have to do that work, or I'm making assumptions that she's going to want to be just like me, and that may not be the case.
And would you? I would think that the additional element of that would be to really understand their strengths, so that you can properly direct that. Is that an important element?
Yeah, I love that. And, again, I think this takes the discernment and the listening and the observing and noticing what the talents and strengths and potential are. And I think along with that, I need to be sure to give her the feedback about that. That's that really fundamental affirmation element of mentoring. I need to give her the feedback, and especially in a male-centric environment like the military, where women can sometimes be the only in the room and I think be made to feel like imposters as a result. I want to go out of my way to do the affirmation and say, wow, that was terrific, or I'm so glad they hired you or promoted you or whatever it is, they got it right. And now let's think about next steps. I got to be doing the all-in affirming and pointing out her talents.
Oh, that's great. Just for the audience, I won't be asking all the questions. We'll open up probably the last 15 or 20 minutes to allow those on Facebook to pose questions. So I do want to ask the audience to be thinking about what they'd like to ask the authors. So as we go forward, one of the things that struck me, and I'd like to understand this more, is the idea that it's better for men to mentor women than other women to mentor women, and particularly in the military, where there perhaps are fewer senior female mentors. But has that trend changed? Are we seeing advances in that area where it makes sense for women to mentor other women?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And I think that there's a lot of great evidence that, women are incredible mentors, right? And they provide so much, again, the same kind of career and psychosocial functions, these functions that are so important to us in our development. But, one of the challenges that you're pointing out, Admiral, is that as you look around, even today in our force, that it's really challenging to find a lot of senior women to do that. And one of the great things, we're doing, I think, a much better job today recruiting talented women coming in the front door into our profession. There's a lot of them. And if we expect all of our senior women to mentor all of the junior women coming in, there's just not enough of them. And they have day jobs and they have responsibilities and other things to be doing too. And so men need to be doing their fair share of it. And the same way that we would hope that senior women are mentoring junior men out there too. The other part of this is that, in the research, Brad and I were looking at this, that women often get over-mentored in a lot of ways. We see that, under-sponsored, over-mentored. And part of that is that when they're being mentored by men in particular, sometimes they're not getting the same quality and the same aspects of mentoring that men are getting with each other. And part of that is the advocacy part of this, because men often hold that back from in providing that. But there's other aspects too that, again, men don't often give all the psychosocial functions, aspects of the affirmation that Brad was mentioning earlier. They often are going to, not provide the challenging feedback, the direct, actionable feedback that these women need. Often, concern over emotions might be a challenge that guys have when it comes to a mentoring relationship. So there's a lot of benefits, right, to engaging and having men do more of the mentoring, but we also have to be better at how we do that mentoring.
Yeah, and I would just add that women are not less effective mentors than men. In fact, all the research, and I think where that question comes from is there's good research showing that when a woman has a male mentor, she makes more money in the corporate world or she gets more promotions in the military. This is not because men are better mentors. It's simply back to that mathematics issue. There's just more men who have rank and power. So want to just really clarify that women are just as effective mentors for other women. We just don't have enough. And as Dave said, it is an unfair burden on our senior women if we expect them to mentor all the junior women coming in the door.
Well, thank you. And I think in the book, you talk about the value to the mentor himself. And I found that particularly compelling. Certainly in those situations where I've had an opportunity to be a mentor, it has opened my eyes. And I think there's a lot of bi-directional value. But what's been your experience and what's the feedback that you've gotten?
Yeah, so I will just start off by saying both David and I have had really salient female mentors in our career. And that, I think, has been really important for us in terms of our own learning and our development of empathy, our understanding of the value of women in leadership, all of those things. The research is really interesting here. There's a huge WIFM for men. What's in it for me when I have women that I mentor? So we find men getting better interpersonally. Their EQ gets a bit stronger, their empathy, their capacity for listening and understanding the experiences of women in the workplace. Dave and I would call this your gender intelligence. Your GQ goes up a bit, the more exposure you have to talented women, either as a mentor or a mentee. And remember, a lot of these interpersonal skills that we find men getting better at when they're mentoring across gender are things that they get to take home with them, right? You don't check those at the door. I get to take those home and they make me a more effective partner and father. So there's added value that way. And then certainly my networks are broader. We find men with a lot of women mentees have bigger networks. They have more intel about what's happening in the organization. And frankly, a lot of these men told us that they just develop these lifelong friendships with women that really make their career more enjoyable. So there's a lot in this for guys. Yeah, it's a really important point.
Yeah, and there's a leadership piece to this too. All of those components make you a better leader as well, but it also becomes part of how you're viewed by the rest of the people in your organization. You're seen as one. This is part of your leadership brand now, that you're a diverse mentor. You're really looking at talent of all kinds and really helping the organization to diversify. And certainly, as we have a more diverse workforce today than we've ever had, we need leaders who can do this.
Thank you. So clearly, there's value for both mentor and mentee. So what are the sources of friction? What are the barriers? Or why isn't this happening more in your view?
Yeah, this came up in both Athena Rising and in the most recent book, Good Guys. But, there were so many of these kind of ideas and reasons and mindsets that held guys back and kept them on the sidelines that we actually titled this The Reluctant Male Syndrome in the book there. And this has, one is just kind of perceptions, right? How do we see people? How do we see the people that we're mentoring or potential mentees out there? And if we see, in particular as men, if we perceive women not to be leader material or strong or some sort of a risky investment, a flight risk of some sort, that we're going to withhold, because mentoring requires time and effort, right? We're going to withhold resources like that. Some men even talked about the fact that, they were a little anxious about what that might mean to have this close, intimate relationship with a junior woman, because they said, wow, I was brought up in a family, obviously, with a mother, and some men talked about their sisters, and today maybe their wives or daughters, and they said, very comfortable with a script that society and my family has given me on how to enact those relationships. But I don't really feel like I had a really good, script to follow when it came to a mentoring relationship in this way, having this close relationship. And And the unfortunate part of that is sometimes men would fall back on what we would call their man scripts. And these are socialized scripts that we've heard before, things, and certainly the military, we've seen the notion of kind of the chivalry, right? The knight in shining armor, right? And again, those can be they might sound nice and look nice on the outside, but they can be kind of damaging because they disempower and undermine women's ability to have their career advanced in that way. And and then finally, I think the last part of it was really about perceptions. We heard a lot about this, that, gosh, if I start to suddenly mentor a junior woman, might people start to think, what's going on here? Might they start to talk and gossip in some way? And so, our response to men was, well, if that's the case, then don't mentor one woman, mentor lots of women, mentor a dozen of them. Mentor lots of them at once. And it's just part of who you are and your brand as being an inclusive mentor. And that way you can get over that.
That's a great point. Thank you. And I guess a natural follow-on. Certainly, we're well aware from the media, with the Me Too movement, and I think it kind of goes to the point that you just made. And so, are you seeing we probably were making progress? Did you see a step backwards as a result of Me Too, or do we just need to focus more on techniques like being a mentor to multiple junior women as a way forward?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Admiral. And yeah, the answer is yes. So Dave and I were out on the road, in 2017, talking about Athena Rising, right? And talking to men about leaning into mentorships with women. And then Me Too goes widespread. And all the research post Me Too is showing that men, at least in the corporate world, about 60% of men post Me Too are now saying, I'm sorry, I'm just not comfortable mentoring a woman, or even having a coffee conversation alone with a woman at work. That makes me really uncomfortable. And so, it's a bit frustrating for us because a lot of this is just based on false narratives, of course, right, about what Me Too is about. And, we have to go out of our way to remind men about, hey, let's reset about what Me Too is. Me Too is women asking to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed. It's an incredibly low bar for men to get over. But you're hearing the false narratives that no, actually women are scary, right? They make false accusations. It's not safe to interact with them. Dave and I have looked at the data. It doesn't exist. It's just not true. Women don't make false accusations in any measurable number. It's a rare event. I really think if you're a bumbling guy like Dave and I trying to be better allies in the workplace, probably more likely to get struck by lightning than have a false accusation made against you. And as a clinical psychologist, I just love to tell men, hey, if you still have anxiety about interacting with women, there's only one cure for that, and it's exposure therapy. You need to have more interaction, more conversations, more mentoring. Don't make that her problem, that you feel anxious. You need to lean into that and do your own exposure.
Yeah, and so really, it's really the solution, not the problem, isn't it? The application of mutual respect, the tools of mentorship, hopefully will reduce some of those perceived differences that have led to that harassment. So that's terrific. Thank you. So let's talk tactics for a moment. If I'm a woman watching right now and I recognize that I don't have any male allies in my corner, no man who seemed particularly attuned or interested in my experience, how do I get that started? As the Surgeon General of the Navy, should I be starting formal mentoring programs, or what's the best way forward there to get after this issue?
Yeah, lots of great tactics here. And certainly, since we have a Navy audience today, there's a lot of history here, too, when it comes to mentoring programs that we have to think about as well and take into consideration. But I think just from an individual perspective for a minute here, think about, if, again, for the women out there, maybe a junior woman looking to increase or diversify her mentoring network, and to bring some really thoughtful men into that, is to begin to start thinking about, all right, so who are the men that kind of you admire, that you work with, those guys that kind of get it already? kind of understand. They already show and demonstrate some of that empathy and understanding and of people's experiences out there that you would like to connect with. The other one I think is think very tactically also about what are the specific goals or skills or things that you would like to expand upon from a mentoring perspective, and look around again, and who are those men you could collaborate with and maybe look at as a mentor in some way. But I think the tactical part of the ask is really critical here, and Brad and I always like to talk about this because I think both directions, for men, offering to mentor women, and for women asking, for mentoring from men, I think there can be some awkwardness there. And certainly, if you've ever had somebody come up to you and ask, hey, will you be my mentor? It's like, wow, out of the blue, out of the cold, that's a really big ask, right? Because you're asking for a relationship, and depending on what you've already got there and how well you know each other, that might be kind of a far-fetched ask at that point. And so we often, Brad and I like to recommend that start with a small ask and a very contextualized ask. For example, I'm really interested in learning more about orthopedic surgery, Admiral, and I would really, I admire some of the work you've done, and I'd like to learn more about that. Would it be, it would be an opportunity for us to have a conversation so I can learn more about those opportunities. And there I've contextualized it so exactly what it is I'm interested in. And I haven't asked for a relationship. I've asked for, a conversation, maybe coffee. And from there, we can see where it grows and what it goes into. And what we often find is this, again, the exposure that we get with each other, the more we get to know each other, the more people get to like each other, and the closer they are, the more engaged they become in the relationship and the developmental aspects of it. So, and it overcomes some of those awkwardness and maybe some of the anxiety that he might have.
Yeah, and I would just add, you asked about programs. I don't know if you recall, but about 12 years ago, the CNO at the time got very excited about mentoring, which was great. And I like to think that a lot of the research my colleagues and I were doing at the academy at the time fueled that a little bit. But then he maybe made the mistake of saying, okay, let's make sure every sailor in the Navy has a mentor, make it so. And so it became this huge kind of paper drill where every sailor had to be matched. As a consequence of that, I think for the next 10 years, whenever you mention mentoring in the fleet, you got this cringe reaction from, naturally from a lot of folks. So I think you have to be careful about over-legislating this, about over-formalizing it, about making programs that are really just programs. I think a bigger kind of interesting question is, how do you create a culture of mentoring? And how are people encouraged to do this? How are people reinforced and recognized for it? Did you and your folks have a sense that senior members of the military take time, ask them, check in? We call that kind of mentor of the moment behavior. Am I the kind of person that will stay after a meeting because I see someone was struggling a little bit just to check in? Or, somebody just checked into the command. Am I the kind of person that will stop in the hallway and say, hey, swing on by if I can, offer any guidance or support? Or, it's that kind of culture that I think just breeds a sort of mentoring that we'd like to see more of, versus demanding that everybody participate in a program.
Well, that's true. That's really helpful because I do remember that specific that era and the idea that it was really now programmatic and something that we had to actively monitor. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity with what you've learned in gender differences to open the aperture and look, particularly in this time in our country where we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement and other recognition that we've got work to do as a country to respect difference. And so how would you recommend we apply the tools that you describe for those larger issues of inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, well, I can start with some of the interpersonal, Dave, and maybe you've got some of the more systemic public kinds of things. But, it's interesting. We recently were asked about this. So in our research for Good Guys, we have a whole book full of very tactical ally actions for, how do I as a guy show up in the workplace every day for my female colleagues? What does that look like? And, it includes a lot of the things that we've been talking about today: listening, not making assumptions, making sure she's included, noticing what's happening in meetings, in other contexts, and kind of improving my situational awareness. When we look carefully at those, almost all of them apply really very neatly to other groups that are marginalized in the workplace. So, if we're talking about our colleagues of a different race or LGBTQ colleagues, same sort of ally actions and strategies really prove to be equally valuable and beneficial. So I would encourage folks to sort of think about not staying on the sidelines, entering in with some real humility and a learning orientation. And perhaps, if you're not sure, ask to ask, so we love that strategy. So, I've noticed that you're the only Black female resident in ortho. Could we just talk about what's that like for you? And I'm really interested. I'd love to learn. And is it okay if I ask you about that? I think conveying that kind of genuine interest often opens the door to learning about the experience of your colleagues that might be marginalized.
Yeah, I think it really helps to have kind of an open mind, this learning orientation and curiosity about how other people might experience the workplace differently than I do. And if we do have that open mind, we have that curiosity and that wherewithal to develop some understanding, whether that's, again, through self-education, through our relationships with others, and certainly mentoring relationships is one great way to do that. If you think about your mentoring network, those you are mentored by and those who you mentor, you should do a quick audit of that and see how diverse is that, or does everybody in my network look just like me? Because those are opportunities for you to learn both directions and apply that. And I think as we begin to understand how people experience the workplace a little bit differently, then we can think about how can we be public advocates for policies and programs and practices, right, that are more equitable for everyone and not just for myself.
Very good, thank you. So looking back, this is a leading question, and we're starting to get some questions from the field. So I want to get to those, but perhaps my last question is, and a leading question for good guys. But you look back on Athena Rising, you look back on your experience and having discussions related to the book. Are there things that you would include in a second edition, or does Good Guys pick those up and extend the discussion?
Yeah. I think there's always lots of things, and it's the timing of when you write a book and when a book comes out is always very interesting. And certainly ours, I think, was, I don't know, from my perspective, was really interesting in the fact that we wrote this pre-pandemic. So we were actually done writing as the pandemic occurred, and it was off to the publisher at that point. And so there's no more. Despite the fact that there were lots of things changing, and of course that summer with the racial tensions around the George Floyd murder and everything else that was going on in our country, there were a lot of things that we would have loved to have gone back in and reworked. Certainly the idea is, one, we talked about this early in the book of Good Guys about the kind of the nature of work, the fact that for decades and centuries, work has been created by men for men to do men's, work out there. And, others have felt like, including women, it felt like that just doesn't work for them in a lot of different ways. And they've had to adapt to the very masculine workplace. And certainly I think over the course of the last year, we've seen where programs that have often been stigmatized or labeled as women's programs, so things like flex work and remote work, well, I think over the last year, we've pulled the cover off of that one, and we all know the value added when it comes to that in particular. And same thing, I think the way our country broadly and our organizations and institutions approach the notion of childcare and caregiving, I think we're seeing some dramatic changes and shifts in that as we think about how do we go back, how do we re-envision this new world of work, how do we incorporate the best of what we learned over the last year into that. And I think certainly that's one aspect. Brad, other ideas?
Well, I think the other big one, and I'm thinking about Athena Rising. In Good Guys, we talked a lot more about the intersections of race and gender, and race and LGBTQ identities and gender. But in Athena Rising, we didn't touch on that quite as much. And I think if we could rewrite it or do a second edition at this point, I think that would be a bigger focus when we're talking about mentoring women. How can I be more attuned to intersectional identities? And how can I be more open and curious about my mentees' different identities? And how can I welcome conversation from her about understanding those, if she's willing to share? How can I create a kind of safe space in this relationship where that feels very comfortable for her to talk about? And then how can I build some of my own gender awareness and racial awareness and awareness of other identities, basically do my own self-education so I'm a more effective mentor to different groups?
Oh, thank you. So the first question is from Natasha Sokolowski, and it's, does empowering women translate to tangible empowerment for men, or do you see men feeling disabled by empowered women?
That's interesting.
Yeah. Question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a lot of elements to that. Really good question. I think that one of the things that we're seeing in the current conversation around gender is the issue of zero-sum thinking on the part of men, right? And this is that bias, that fallacy that if I, as a member of the group in power, give some of that up and share some of my privilege, I'm going to lose somehow. I'll be diminished somehow if I share my social capital and power. And what we find is that's a real fallacy. If you're thinking about, for example, the corporate world, once we see more women actually promoting and moving into senior leadership, those companies do better. They make more money. They're more effective. This pie that men become concerned with, I don't want to give any of my pie. The pie grows. The pie just becomes more substantial. We all benefit. The organization does better. I think if we could help men see that, what happens when we really include women and there's more diversity of all types, all the way up in meaningful ways into the C-suite or the general officer ranks in our case, I think we could help get over some of that zero-sum thinking.
Yeah, and I think there's also there's more of the with them in this as well for men to think about. This gets back to the empowerment piece that the guys actually benefit in a variety of different ways, despite the fact that they think they're going to lose, right, based on the zero-sum thinking. But there's also this idea that, okay, if I'm involved in, say, for example, a mentoring program that's focused on gender or women out there, that somehow being associated with that or mentoring lots of women, I'm going to be susceptible to the WIMP penalty is one of the research factors that's out there. And, again, the research is really mixed on this, but we find a lot of evidence out there that the men actually gain by doing this because they're now seen as being, again, they're seen as that's part of their leadership brand. And in many ways, they're labeled as, they're a gender champion, right? Because they're out there advocating on behalf and mentoring and advancing women. And this is something that organizations value today. And so in some ways, we often see that they'll get a bump up in things like their performance evaluations and opportunities and just their overall perception. So, what we find is that, yes, there's an advancement of men and women at the same time. And by the way, it helps the organization too. So it's a trifecta.
Oh, that's great. This is from Amy Modglin. Did your research include junior people mentoring senior people? So kind of the reverse of the model we've been describing.
Yeah, that's a great question, and no, we did not include that in our interviews we did for the book. We did include some of the research that's out there. In particular, we're talking about reverse mentoring and lots of great examples and case studies on how reverse mentoring works. And for those not familiar, this where you have a junior member of your organization mentoring a senior member, and there's opportunities here to create interactions because you're kind of forcing these connections in many ways to do this, but you can, again, opportunities to understand another generation, right? And we often find a lack of understanding or empathy around older generations, again, blaming or not understanding the younger generations. And so here's a chance for the younger generation to teach because they're in that role. But the great thing about reverse mentoring is that, again, it tends to be much more reciprocal, and there's always going to be learning going both ways. And so there's obviously a natural way for the senior person to be doing some mentoring and coaching, and certainly the advocacy piece. As they get to know this junior person, they're going to probably put them forward for other things as they appreciate them.
And there was a wonderful corporate example of this that we found in our research. So Procter & Gamble noticed a number of years ago they were bringing all these talented women in the door, not retaining them, not promoting them. And so they kind of creatively started a reverse mentoring or a mentor up program where they would assign a lot of these junior women to very senior male executives in the company with the marching order that she's to be his mentor, right, as Dave was describing. And then an interesting thing happens along the way, right? So she's teaching him. He is so enjoying this relationship, and he's so learning so much from her. He's having all this exposure and contact with her. Of course, now he's recognizing she's really talented and smart and gifted. He starts, of course, mentoring and sponsoring her. So these become these really powerful reciprocal relationships. And within just a few years, Procter & Gamble saw more women moving into really meaningful senior positions as a result of this kind of mutual mentorship. So this can be very powerful, I think.
Very good. Thank you. A comment from Melissa Kennedy. This would be a great addition to the Navy Medicine's culture of excellence. And in fact, I think you're well aware that Ceno, working with CNP and many others, is developing lines of effort to create a culture of excellence as opposed to a culture of compliance. Right. And so any thoughts? Certainly the foundation of mutual respect that we talked about a little bit, but how would you see this fitting into CNO's culture of excellence initiative?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I've got a couple thoughts. I know you do too, Dave. Here's one recommendation. Don't make this topic or this training siloed, meaning, don't set it aside like we do unconscious bias training or other things that we've tried, in the military. What we find are those programs are not very effective in creating really meaningful change. When you weave things like this into existing leadership training, and we've got a lot of that in the Navy, we've got all kinds of schoolhouses where we learn and we talk about what does it take in the next job to be an effective leader. If we're weaving a focus on inclusion and diversity and what does meaningful mentorship and sponsorship look like across difference into those moments, suddenly now this is not just a gender thing, this is a leadership thing. And I think people really start hearing that. They understand that I'm going to be evaluated on this as a leader, and I'm going to listen and take notes because I see this as crucial to who I'm going to be in that leader role.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, with Ceno Richardson a few years ago, we had a conversation about this in particular as he was working on the update for the leader development framework. And so you see that focus in there on the mentorship, but also the recommendation we also had to how do we begin to think about the sponsorship and what's the language around sponsorship and advocacy that we can include in that framework, and how do we talk about it? And that's where the notion of the connection that's in there now today came from, is this idea that we can advocate for people through connection. And that's something that is fairly common within the Navy without thinking about it being some sort of favoritism or cronyism out there that I think a lot of people are concerned about as we think about how do we advocate for others out there. So having that framework as a basis and then putting it back into the schoolhouses is such a great way to go.
Fantastic. I like that idea of weaving it into, our training and expectations, because that's really creating culture, isn't it?
Yeah.
So a question from Emily Elliott. how can we help men understand the imposter syndrome? And if possible, could you explain to the audience what is imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So the research around this has been around for a while now. And the original research on the imposter syndrome, and I'll use that word here for a second, that phrase, but focused on women, right, in particular, and how the notion that often, especially in very male-dominated industries and professions out there, women in these organizations can feel like they don't belong, that somehow that they were, sometimes they're told that they were a quota or a diversity hire in today's language. We often hear that somehow they don't belong and that they aren't capable of doing the job in a variety of different ways. And, the reality of it is that men and women have these feelings of being an imposter sometimes. And I think we've all been there when we've been in a new position, for example, in a new role. It can often feel like first time you're in command, it's like that first day, it's like, holy cow, how did I get here? Did the board really make a mistake when they made the selection? And so we all feel these things, right? I think one of the challenges in calling it a syndrome in particular is it has this medical kind of a connotation that there's something wrong with you, right? Is something we ought to work on getting away from. And I think that's something that Brad and I've had a lot of conversations talking about, that like there's something fundamentally wrong with you or you as a woman because you have these feelings. It's like, no, most of us have these feelings one time or another. It's just, right, as guys, we don't talk about it as often, and we're really good at the whole fake it till you make it as men, and so we're all much more about the bravado of I can do this job, and we're just faking it to a certain extent, but we all have these feelings. Brad, other thoughts?
No, I really like that. And again, just one add-on there is, gosh, this is another case for not forgetting the affirmation. This is an easy lift for me. If I've got a junior person, male or female, who's struggling with some of these feelings about being an imposter, I just got to be more attuned to making sure I recognize to give those quick affirmations. Well done. Yes, you do belong here, no matter what you think. That doesn't take much of my time, but I think we can assume that especially really talented people don't need that, but we all need it. We all need the affirmation. So, create an affirmation-rich environment in whatever environment you happen to be leading. I know that my sister is really good at this. I think she spends, 80% of her day just doing affirmations of her team. And I think that goes a long way to helping people with imposter feelings.
But that's also, why it's important to have diversity all the way up through the senior leadership ranks, is because often people look around and they look up and they go, where's the path for me that shows that I can do this and I belong and that I'm valued here as well. And so having people who look like you, especially if you're not in the majority, is really helpful. So having that diversity all the way through the senior leadership ranks is critical.
Great, thank you. And this comment and question is from Christina St. Clair. I am ecstatic. This is a long overdue conversation. What can be done to invite women to the table and help us lean in?
Yeah, well, so it's a great question,
Yeah.
Christina. We spend so much time trying to figure out how to get guys to lean in that sometimes we don't think about it from the other direction. So, sort of along the lines of Sheryl Sandberg's, famous book that Dave and I are big fans of. So I guess in terms of the leaning in piece, let me just kind of answer that from a relational perspective and kind of thinking about building your network or your constellation, because no matter how talented folks like you are, Christina, I think that we still need the mentoring and the sponsoring. And I think that even the most talented folks in the Navy are not going to get as far if they don't have people speaking for them and putting them forward and looking for those opportunities. So we often describe this as making sure that you've got a constellation of folks in your corner. And I think you've got to be very deliberate about this, kind of collect mentors and sponsors along the way. And Recognize that, somebody may be really terrific for one tour or one issue that you're dealing with. And then you need to move on and find other folks too. Many of these will be lifelong mentoring relationships. Some of them will just be mentors of the moment. All of them together, though, really make you much more effective in moving forward in your career. So be somewhat active in initiating these mentor of the moment kinds of conversations. As Dave mentioned with you, let's ask you if you'll go to coffee with us and just talk about this thing that you do. I know that that's often going to lead to another relation or another conversation, and that's how wonderful informal mentoring begins. But I do have to be seen, and I do have to initiate a lot of those contacts.
Two other real quick ones on that. I would say that it's not women's job or role or responsibility to give guys a pat on the back when they're doing this well, but as Brad mentioned before, I think positive reinforcement and affirmation is always a great feeling, right? Let's reinforce the things that we want more of out there, that we want to value and reward in some way. And again, we don't want to put men on a pedestal for doing what they're supposed to be doing, but again, a little positive reinforcement, finding ways to acknowledge that, I think, is always helpful. And the second piece is, don't forget that, when you see those men out there, especially junior men that you work with, that you feel like, this guy's really got something, he's going to go far. Don't forget that mentoring him, right, you can make a tremendous difference, right? Overall, the same way that it works for men mentoring women mentoring men, it makes a tremendous difference in their outlook and in the way they approach relationships and diversity in the workplace. So, include a few of those talented guys out there in your network and make a difference for them.
So it's interesting as the conversation has evolved today. We started talking about men, mentoring downward, and then we had an excellent question about what about the reverse. And now recognizing that there are really opportunities in all directions, and so really kind of a three-dimensional mentoring model, if you will. So perhaps that'll be book 3.
Yeah.
Or 4.
Or 4. Yeah.
And you can tie it somehow into cyberspace, and it'll be a big
right. Or just add the word diet to the end, and
So I think we'll wrap up with kind of the last question, and tremendously appreciate your time. And I know the audience, based on the responses that we're getting, have been very grateful for your thoughts and your wisdom in this very important area. But as you've traveled and given presentations, have there been any questions that really stood out as surprises or reactions, either male or female reactions that you'd share with us that help us even understand the issue better?
Interesting.
A couple I can think of.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, so, I guess one from men is that sometimes we often get this, and it's kind of a what some people have termed a modern sexism perspective, and it's this idea that somehow in the 21st century we've overcome all the gender discrimination and inequalities and equities that are out there. That was so 20th century, right? We're past that. Why are we even talking about this, right? Women are on a level playing field, and so this ignoring, right, the inequities that are right there in your face and the discrimination that's going on, and so that's an interesting one. Certainly, the evidence, I think, is a great way to come back at that conversation, which is usually how we present that. And then I would also I typically ask those male leaders, how do you know, right? So have you had these conversations with your female colleagues and the people that you work with out there, and see what they think about that? And then, the other one from women that we sometimes get is that, hey, we don't need guys. You guys just get out of our way, and 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 that's all we need you to do is just get out of our way, and we'll be fine. And we certainly understand that perspective. But I think the reality is that it's going to take all of us working together to do this work, and that we need to bring men to the table to have this conversation and to see what their role is and what it looks like, whether it's from a mentoring, a sponsoring, an allyship perspective. We all have a role in accomplishing this together.
Yeah, and I think for me, honestly, the biggest surprise in a lot of this work is all of the stuff going around us every day, going on around us, like take your typical meeting. Dave and I, before we started doing these interviews, were entirely unaware of the gender dynamics women face in your average, apparently harmless meeting. But it really is kind of almost a fight club experience for women in a meeting. They're interrupted 3 times more than men. And then, Dave and I, we were doing the interviews for Athena Rising. I can't tell you how many women said, often I'm in a meeting and I give this creative, great idea and everyone's like, yeah. And then, 5 minutes later, some guy repackages my idea and he gets credit for it. And they actually told us there's a name for this, being bro-appropriated. This is, I don't see this because it doesn't happen to me, and Dave doesn't see it because, as guys, we're oblivious to a lot of these dynamics. And I think this has been a huge eye-opener for us, just to become more situationally aware and start to notice some of the dynamics going on daily. And it's only when that happens that I'm in a position that I get to disrupt or say something or change the balance a little bit.
Great. And I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to end on a positive. And I'm a huge fan of appreciative inquiry, the idea that organizations prosper by identifying what they do particularly well and building on it. So in this area, where have you seen the most progress?
Well, we're seeing, I'll just throw one out. We're actually seeing a big movement, believe it or not, toward grassroots men as allies sort of organizations. So, for years and years, there have been women's networks and women's organizations in companies and organizations. Now we're seeing groups of men say, hey, we want to play a role here, want to be a part of equity and inclusion. So they're starting to form, male ally chapters and start to have conversations because, you know what? Men care about the kind of world their daughters are going to be entering, and they want it to look different than the one they entered. So I think that's been a nice change.
I've been doing this work for a while now, and even when I was on active duty, and I think, one of the things that struck me was as we saw shifts back in the 2016, 2017 era in particular, around policies and programs and things like the career intermission program, right? Acknowledging the fact that as men and women, there are needs and desires out there to be able to do this and to be able to continue to serve and find ways to do that, right? Acknowledging some of that was kind of that started off as a pilot program and then quickly expanded, as the Navy did really well with it, expanded across the services. And then I think certainly the advances around policies like parental leave and changing that, and the amount that we have there for now looking at it as primary and secondary caregivers, and acknowledging that, hey, as men and women, we all have caregiving responsibilities, and finding a way within the work that we do and the important service that we have, how do we incorporate that as part of who we are as service members and value that? And I think that's really, to me, that gives me a lot of hope and optimism for the future about things that we're already kind of on the path to setting a great example.
Great. Well, again, thank both of you for your time today, for the terrific work represented by Athena Rising and Good Guys, and of course, your service to our nation while you're on active duty. Shameless plug for the SG's reading list, all of which are on the MWR Overdrive site. Please, to the audience, those who work for Navy medicine or under our umbrella, not homework, it's opportunity. And as you can tell from today's discussion, tremendous amount that we can learn by reading and then by discussing what we've read. True privilege to have both Dr. Smith and Johnson with us today. Gentlemen, thank you again. and I've got my work cut out for me as I look to how I can be a better mentor moving forward. So thank you very much, and that's all we have for today.
Thanks, Admiral.
Thanks, Admiral.
Thank you very much.